Very quickly, before we dive into the content of today's session, I'd like to let everyone know that we are offering simultaneous English-Spanish interpretation for today's session. And in a moment, you will see the option to choose the language you would like to listen in and participate in today. This will show up as a small globe or network sign within your Zoom controls, and then you can select English or Spanish. I'd also like to introduce our colleague, Lucia, from the Colorado Language Connection to explain more about how this works in Spanish.
Hola, buenos días. Me llamo Lucía. Voy a ser su intérprete hoy en español. Si necesitan interpretación, puede poner clic en el botón de abajo de la pantalla y ahí será interpretación al mismo momento en español para quien lo necesite. Gracias.
Thank you, Lucia. Appreciate it. Just a moment here while we get that set up. Well, welcome again. Today's session is about what does the data mean and does it reflect what the community is seeing and experiencing? I'd like to introduce myself once again. My name is Eve Kucharski. I'm a communications specialist that works with the Colorado Equity Compass, and I am joined today by my colleagues, Rochelle Espiritu, managing partner, Scott Van Loo, who is project director, and Alina Taniuchi, who is project manager. Just as before, if you've attended previous sessions, we welcome you to stay on camera. Otherwise, please put an asterisk by your name so that we will know that you will be listening in only today and we will not call on you. Please also, we encourage you to be an active participant in the session. We want to hear from you and read your thoughts and ideas in the chat, so we welcome you to share them. As you know, live simultaneous Spanish-English interpretation is available should you need it, and the session is recorded and will be posted online, so please send a private message to Alina Taniuchi if you would prefer your verbal/chat responses to not be recorded and show up on that recording to be accessible later on. Next slide, please. So this is just a brief agenda for our time together. We will explore the meaning of data, integrate ethical and equity considerations in data analysis, understand the importance of engaging community, employ different strategies to analyze data, share resources to support data analysis, and maybe even a little bit more. So I'll ask for the next slide, please. And quickly, these are our last two sessions coming up. On March 8th, we will have session 6, How do we gather and share stories? And session 7 will be on March 22nd. How do we bring together the data, story or stories, and visualizations in clear, compelling, and equitable manner? Next slide, please. So I thought we would get started with a quick community builder. I would love if people could share a time when you've had additional questions about data that's being presented to you. And I can begin. I was telling my colleagues earlier, I think this is something we've all done whenever you receive, a flyer or an ad online. It's always probably good to be healthily skeptical of some of the stats that are presented to you. So that's just sort of an everyday example, but I'm sure this is something that is applicable on all levels. So I welcome anybody to take a moment to think about this and share in the chat, or please unmute if this is something that you'd like to share verbally.
Eve, I'll just add in while people are thinking. I've always had questions about the sources of data. So whenever I see data, maybe about the efficacy of a drug or of a particular treatment, I'm always curious around who funded the data collection, who collected the data, and who presented it, and who's missing from the analysis. So I'm always curious around those things around data.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Rochelle. It's certainly considerations that I think we don't always make on a surface level. So it's good to be thoughtful about that. Anybody else? Oh, thank you, Maria. He said our state health department's reporting of cancer statistics for a region, it seems like it's underreported. Interesting. If you're open to it, to unmuting, you're welcome to share more, but no problem if not.
think two of the things that are usually on my mind are kind of that idea of where did it come from, you know, who funded it, who was included in the survey, who was not included in it. And then also, like, what are the bigger implications now that we have this data? What do we do with these numbers moving ahead? Do we use this to change programming or offer different resources? Yeah.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it. And I saw Scott shared in the chat, tend to ask who or what is missing from the data being presented. Definitely all good considerations. Well, thank you all for just pondering this question for a minute. It certainly will come up later as we think about the information presented today. And we welcome questions or thoughts in the chat if maybe you think of an answer to this question later on. Next slide, please. So this transitions us nicely into the start of the presentation into what is data analysis, sometimes known as sense making. The National Library of Medicine describes it as the practice of working with data to extract meaningful information. So of course, this can include description, statistical model fitting, qualitative coding, visualization, to gain insights from that data. So that could be anything from finding means, medians, and counts of different groups, finding correlations between variables, coding interviews for themes, and finding patterns within data visualization. The standards that you see at the bottom of the slide are from ChangeMatrix's Data Sense Making Toolkit. Before doing any kind of data analysis, it's also good to do a quick overview of these 4 standards. If you can see if it is useful, evaluation results should be answering the questions that are important to the key stakeholders that you are working with. And the information you collect should address your evaluation questions and encourage stakeholders to actually use the findings. You should assess if it's feasible. The evaluation should be well planned, make sense, and be a good use of your resources. Assess the ethics. So the evaluation should follow ethical standards with regard to the rights of the participants and those who contributed evaluation data, and be fair in its assessment and acknowledging conflict of interest that might arise. And it should be accurate. The data and information collected should be reliable and valid with a systematic review of the data, and the findings should be justifying any recommendations that you may have. Next slide, please. So now we can go into why data analysis is actually important. As we all know, data sharing and integration to inform decision-making occurs across government entities, organizations, and it's now more commonplace than ever, and it occurs at every level, local, state, and federal. And so this is why it's vital to consider data analysis and the impact of sharing it. And because data analysis impact on communities and possibly the perception of a community as a result of it, there are deep ethical considerations to be made, especially because, as is pointed out by the Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy organization from the University of Pennsylvania, the emphasis on racial equity, transparency, and community engagement is often something that is very peripheral, and it's not emphasized first and foremost. And as I stated before, this is especially troubling because it is programs that produce administrative data that have often played a direct role in creating, enabling, and sustaining institutional and structural racism. So here's just a quick few tips to make sure that racial equity considerations are being made in your own data analysis. If you're making comparisons, try to make sure that they are fair and appropriate, have multiple people on your team look at the data separately, and think about incorporating a racial equity lens during the data analysis process, and about the historical context that might be at play here that you wouldn't be considering otherwise. But my colleagues will dive into that a little bit deeper later on in the presentation. And lastly, in order to adhere to these standards, it's also valuable to do some planning for the process. Ask yourself, who on your team will take the lead? What are some of the questions you'll be hoping to answer when you start collecting this data? Who is going to be involved in this sense-making process? When will you engage them, and how will you use this information? So that brings me to the next slide. This is the continuum of community engagement or a scale, I suppose, which is vital to consider from an ethical perspective of involving the community being researched or worked with in the data analysis process. So on the left of the scale, you'll see inform, and we have the most basic form of community engagement, simply informing the community of progress and findings. And you'll see it progresses to having the community provide feedback, to working with the community to make sure the concerns are reflected in the evaluation, as well as allowing them to review the findings. And then we have the community participate in the decision-making process. And lastly, we actually empower them to drive the sense-making and analysis to recommend how these findings are ultimately used. So now that we see this continuum, I'll actually take it to the next slide for a more interactive portion of the presentation. Please visit the Menti. You can use your phone and use that QR code, and you can actually mark on the continuum where you fall within this sort of data sense making chart. It's a good exercise to just sort of see where you might be aligned. Oh, and thank you so much for sharing it in the chat. In just a sec here, we'll also show the results. So you should see a little pin where you can I'm pulling it up too because I'm actually curious.
Yeah, so this one is slightly different from Mentis we've done before, where you just kind of put where you feel like you are in terms of your engagement with community. And one of the things that we really like about this visual is that even those circles kind of really depict kind of what direction information is flowing from inform, where information is, you see all the arrows going out to little dots. With consults, arrows coming in. So you're receiving the information. Involving is bidirectional. Collaborating indicates a little bit more relationships, and then empower, kind of those full circles. So yeah, I'm seeing the pins drop, Eve. It's looking cool.
Okay, very cool. Just a second while I...
Do you want me to share my screen?
Yeah, actually, that would be fantastic. Okay. And then we could just see where people are falling within the continuum.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you. Wow, so it looks like nobody's on the far left of the scale in terms of informing the community only. Everybody's at least at a consult level. And we're sort of middling here and not up to the empowerment stage, which and correct me if I'm wrong, Rochelle, but I think that takes like the largest amount of community engagement involvement from the start of the process all the way through to the end, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the ideal that the field is hoping for is to move to this space where community is really driving all aspects of an evaluation. And we know that, there might be particular components of an evaluation phase where community is driving the process. Maybe it's at the beginning, and kind of thinking about all phases of evaluation, though. It's important to think about how can community drive in all phases of evaluation, ultimately for the recommendations, especially Eric, as you were mentioning earlier, like for action, like how can they drive that?
Yeah, thanks so much for stating that, Rochelle. I'm curious, would anybody like to share maybe in the chat or just to unmute quickly about why they feel they're at this stage? If not, that's okay too. we can move on, but it's useful to think of your position on the scale and think about the methods that you might use in order to get toward that empower level. Thank you so much for sharing screen. I appreciate it. Mm-hmm. And now I think I'll pass it to you and Scott.
Thank you so much. Rochelle and I will be going back and forth a little bit here on the next few slides. And just building off of that last activity, this is a framework to kind of think about the work from beginning to end. But since we're in this stage of analysis, this concept of doing no harm versus thinking along this continuum to value added. And I'm going to put this link in the chat because it's a great resource for you, this guidebook where we got this particular graphic from. And so the idea in the analysis stage is you're constantly going back as you are in the planning stage to think about your community in really deep and meaningful ways. And you're really thinking about exactly what this says. Is what I'm doing or the actions that we're doing when we're undertaking this evaluation or this analysis in any way causing harm? And you have to be very thoughtful of that. And ideally, you're checking in with your community about that as well. Some considerations, for example, if you're asking for stories like we have on our website, they might be high stakes for some folks to share, to be on camera, to share their story, or to share, be vulnerable or share things maybe they haven't shared, especially in a public way. And then we also have to be thoughtful about how people might use that or might interpret information, including those stories. So moving across to the value added, we're adding care, we're adding value. Another way to think about this is going beyond the gift card, right? So we're not just thanking people for giving us something, but how are we contributing back to the person or the community or the well-being, or that we're actually giving value to people, and especially those that participate in a process. So ideally, it comes together in this really communal aspect, as we saw in that last graphic that he presented, where we're benefiting, they're benefiting, the community is benefiting, there's value added at every step along the way. And this is a great place to stop and take a look at that value added within this analysis piece. So we can stop sharing for a moment, and we're just going to go to a question. And the question is, think about the idea of ethical and equity in your evaluation. And what are some of the considerations that you can come up with when around ethical and equity considerations in data analysis? And you can either unmute or put those in the chat. So just turn your brain for a second over to thinking about analysis. What kinds of equity or ethical considerations can you take into account? And you know how we love it when you unmute. And hello again, it's nice to see some of you that we've seen for a long time. And welcome some of you that are new.
I guess the first main one comes to mind is privacy, right? It's just making sure that, I think for us, we live in a small town, so figuring out how to ask the right questions without exposing any sort of,
Thank you.
exposing their information.
I think, Eric, you brought that up previously too, right? And the small town and having to be really considerate of privacy and even non-identifying information that you get. Okay, and Maria said if the info collected will potentially stigmatize a person or people even more. Right. Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing how folks can twist things. I remember a long time ago, I got to go to the state and testify on behalf of the DREAM Act. And it was in terms of higher education, allowing students to be able, the issue was, I had a student that lived 10 miles from the university that I was working. But because he was a DREAM actor, he had to pay not just out of state, but out of country tuition to the university because the papers weren't ours. So we went and testified. And then, boy, things got twisted around so fast at the state level. They were taking our words and then using them really against for a whole nother agenda. So thank you for that. We have to be really considerate of how we're presenting language and adaptability. Thank you. So Eric, the way I think about that, and please expand if there's something different you're thinking about, but we have to be careful of our terminology, make sure that the words we're using are easily translatable, and that we're not speaking at a level that's overly academic or overly evaluative, right? That we're using language that is accessible by all. Okay, anybody else? Autumn, Zach, Christy, June, anything else you want to add? Ariel, nice to see you again.
I think that the context is really important. I mean, you can, to some of the other comments, if you don't have their personal narrative or their story along with the data, that can be manipulated.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The context is very important, right? And I think you're almost talking to Christy and humanizing the data too, right?
Yes, that's right.
Especially if we're talking about participants or subjects.
Yeah, humanizing is a good word.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll talk about this some more and but please, if you have anything else, you can unmute or you can put in the chat. But we'll bring in some of these other considerations here in just a moment, but I'll turn it over to Rochelle.
Thanks, Scott. So this next section really is just reminding us that we are all individuals that are participating in data analysis, that we each bring a particular lens into how we view data, how we view the different contexts of the communities in which we work. And so those lenses are always important to be aware of or to rise to the surface. And so as we look at a process of data analysis where we're thinking about us as evaluators or researchers or community members, there will always be different perspectives and experiences that we each bring into the space. And so I just like this visual as a reminder that there is me in this process, there is you as in others in the process that are engaged in data analysis, but that together collectively we become stronger when we get to hear about each person's interpretation or how they make meaning of data. And it always just kind of broadens the way that we might think about the results and the context for those results as well. And so this is just another way to look at that engagement process as a reminder of some of the considerations that we need to take as individual humans in this whole process. No data is without bias. I mean, sometimes we think numbers are numbers, but there is meaning behind those numbers, and how we interpret those numbers and how we share those numbers can be framed by our own worldview and experiences. Just wanted to kind of reset ourselves in that thinking of data analysis. And Scott's going to go a little bit deeper into that in terms of implicit biases.
Thank you so much. And it's correct. Data does have biases because we have biases. And as our human condition, our brain naturally has biases. And this is 100% of the human population. There is no one that is free from bias. And if you are interested, you can take a test that I put into, if you haven't done this, into the chat space. Harvard years ago developed this instrument or series of instruments called the implicit associations test. And you can go into different areas and take a look. Not right now because it takes a long time, but you need to give yourself about 20 to 30 minutes per test. But biases are attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understandings, and they can be positive or negative. So they're not necessarily a bad thing. And we're going to talk a little more concretely about what some of those biases are that have been researched and studied. But I think the important thing is our brain, the way that our brain functions and is wired. We can take in, I think the capacity of the brain is something like 10 or 11 million pieces of information per minute, but we're only able to process about 40 to 50 of those pieces of information. Excuse me. So if you think about all of your senses and then some, that's how we come up with these biases, and they can be based on many things. So we can go to the next slide. So here's some common types of bias. There are many, 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 and many more that have been named. We just wanted to go over a few though here. This is confirmation bias. And that is the tendency to favor information that confirms your previously existing beliefs or biases. Okay, so perhaps you already have an idea of what's happening when you're starting your study, or you have a previous study. So that confirmation bias is you're quickly going to the information that goes, see, I told you. The second one is what we call a bias blind spot. And that's the tendency to see ourselves as less biased than other people, and especially in this context of equity work, et cetera, or be able to identify more cognitive biases in others than oneself. Okay, so again, coming back to that visual that Rochelle shared with us, there's a lot of introspection you need to do when you're thinking about analysis, and especially around this issue of bias. Perception bias is the tendency to form stereotypes and assumptions about certain groups that make it impossible to make an objective judgment about members of those groups. So again, we have deeply held beliefs, right, that are centered on our affinities, on our identity, on our ideologies. We ourselves, and if we are putting ourselves in that role of researcher, then we have to really be careful when we're looking at a broad range of groups that we're able to look at that with a level of openness and not bias. Affinity bias is the tendency to show preference to people like ourselves for whatever reason. It could be on any aspect of identity or affinity or ideology, etc. Next one, social desirability bias. I've really seen this show up in schools that I've worked in, especially when we're asking about trying to gather information about a student. And it's the tendency that participants give responses that they believe will be viewed favorably by you or your team as researchers, or other participants, like if you're in a group setting, and especially with questions that might be viewed negatively in society, right? Think about drug use or alcohol use, or in my case, it was asking about behavior of a child. And so we were seeing things at school that oftentimes the parents would say, oh no, that hardly ever happens in the home. And sometimes that was true, and sometimes it was, you know, underneath that might be a parent not wanting to be seen as a bad parent, right? And then researcher bias is when the researcher's beliefs or expectations influence either the design or the data collection, or in this case, the analysis. Okay. And then interviewer bias is, again, that maybe you're selecting folks that are more in line with your ideas, or with how you want the study to go, right? So, or you're picking maybe people that you know or you've worked with before that are easy to access as a sample, okay? And then finally, observer bias is very similar to the researcher bias, but if you're in a role of observing an effect, that you have to be careful about what you're taking notes on, or what you're looking at, okay? And then June has a great question here. Should I be apologizing for having all of these biases? At times I spend more time trying to understand how others view my bias. Right. I think it's more about just being aware of how they're showing up in an analysis, especially a research study, or your work that you're putting out there. I don't think it's necessarily about apologizing, but I think our emphasis here is understanding as that in a human context, we are also part of that context too, and that we naturally carry some of these. So just being aware about it through your work. Rochelle, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, June. And I guess that's why I think when we talk about engaging in data analysis, that I tend to not want to ever do it alone. Because I think that it's hard sometimes to check our own biases. And so, as Scott said earlier, it's not really about that we don't have them. We all do have them, but where we can sit and dialogue and have conversations about when it might be showing up in our data analysis or how we're interpreting data, that's, I think, where it's really important. And so understanding perspective, like what your perspective might be, and others who are in an analysis kind of group is really important so that you get just the broadest picture possible for how to interpret a finding. Yeah, I like that 1970 cutoff point there. There definitely are generational differences. And even when we think about engaging, young people in analysis, there are, different cultural norms or ways of interpreting information. And that's why it's so important to get everyone's perspective in the process. All right, we might move on then to the next slide. But you just want to bring up, in addition to kind of the lenses that we each bring, kind of the me part of that visual that we showed earlier, it's important to also understand kind of the ecosystem in which our data analysis might be occurring. And so as we're looking at data, remembering that, I think Christy brought this up earlier, the context in which the community is or the person is important to bring into the analysis. So as we're looking at maybe housing data or looking at health and housing, remembering that there have been some historic policies that impact the health of people basically because of where they live. And much of that has been a result because of redlining policies that have happened decades ago and continue to impact families that were pushed out of particular neighborhoods or pushed into particular neighborhoods for different reasons. And so making sure that as you're looking at your data, that you're taking into account all of those other factors we've talked to them about as social determinants of health in the past too, but considering those and what influence that might have on the findings and how you interpret the information. Another good example is usually around education, where we often will talk about, the phrase will usually be, our Black and brown students are being maybe expelled from school at higher rates or are performing lower than other groups. And I think what we're encouraging researchers and evaluators to consider is to not kind of put the focus on the group of people, but to really think about what system are they experiencing or what policies might be impacting the outcomes for particular groups of people. So rather than saying, Black and brown students are performing lower than their white counterparts, which is often how data are presented, it might be more of a reframe that this particular school district is not providing the resources and supports that are necessary so that Black and brown students can perform at the best level that they can, that they're given equitable resources to perform in school academically and socially. So I was kind of thinking about what systems are in place versus focusing mostly on the individual at times. So those are just a couple of contextual factors to be thinking about as you're looking at your data and how you interpret it. So we'd love to ask you a little bit more around what are other kind of contextual factors that you think about when you are analyzing data that you might have from a community or with a community. I heard some earlier around size of community, which is definitely another contextual factor to consider, because oftentimes we say we should always be disaggregating data. And in some cases, that's not the right strategy because of the harm it might do for people, or it might identify people And so that's not the right strategy for that particular community. I'm curious to hear of other contextual factors that people consider.
So I like to think about who was even a part of the community. For example, I live in a resort community, so there's a lot of travel throughout Eagle, Pitcairn, and Garfield counties for recreation and work. And then in terms of the population, so the US Census says there's about 17,500 people in Pitcairn County. But of those, is that 17,500 people who are full-time residents? Like how many of those live here part-time? So even just figuring out who is here and when.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Ariel, I think you've mentioned that before, and like really considering what's the lived experience or the perspective then when you're thinking about the data that's collected and how it's presented. Does it make sense to kind of disaggregate in that way, or to provide new like considerations as you're sharing results from data that a consumer of the data might want to make sure they're considering? Thanks for sharing.
Ariel, too, I think perhaps in your case, a lot of the equity considerations are also mobility, that you have communities that are oftentimes in flux. They're coming in, they're coming out. Sometimes with the different visas, you have people that are just there for 3 years, but they also might bring diverse perspectives. And then you also have people that are afraid to be involved in studies like this because they're really just trying to keep a low profile, or they don't want to bring attention to themselves. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought about that from the perspective of like temporary residents on visas, but that is definitely something that happens here, even season to season, like winter, a lot of, I think it's J1 visas for the ski resorts.
It's interesting to think about too, from a data collection and analysis process, like when do you time like data collection and analysis too, and then who by default then gets engaged or who doesn't, depending on what the season is too. That's interesting to think about. Okay, well, we're going to pass it back over to Alina to bring us back to the Document Your Journey tool, so that we've got a couple of questions in there, and then we're going to go into small group breakout time too.
So we will revisit this tool that I think a lot of you all have seen before, but if you're joining us new, not to worry, we will walk you through how to use it. I am lost my Zoom controls to share screen. All right. Okay, so if you follow that link, you should be guided to this document here. And again, for folks who have joined us before, you've heard the spiel. If you want to get up and stretch, take a quick break, that is fine. For those who are new or need a reminder, this is a tool that we have been using over the past few sessions that we've hosted to help you document your storytelling journey. So we ask some guiding questions every session that we provide time for you all to consider during small breakout rooms. And so today's session will focus on slide 7 here, which is around our data analysis. So you'll see some of the questions we've kind of discussed as a full group, and then some additional ones as well. If you are new to this document and you need to make a copy for yourself to be able to edit, you want to go up here to File, Make a Copy, and then Entire Presentation. And it should give you the opportunity to name and place your document where you would like it. And then just click Make a Copy. And then if you are returning and you need to copy over this slide, to your existing slide deck so you can continue to build your story, you'll go to slide 7 and you can click copy by right-clicking on it and clicking copy and then pasting it into the document where you have it. And then we will open up the breakout rooms shortly. I don't know if someone from our team has the ability to make those, but I will just go ahead and share again what some of the questions are that we're asking during you all to discuss during breakout rooms. And we can put them in the chat as well so that they'll follow you into those rooms. But that document your journey will also help focus the conversations.
We are wondering if you would take some time to share with us parts of your conversation from your breakout groups. And again, the questions were, where might there be sources of bias in my data? Who participates in my data analysis, or who might I include moving forward? And how are you going about inviting others into the data analysis process? Or perhaps you talked about something totally different. But would anybody like to unmute and share just a glimpse into your conversations for the benefit of the larger group?
There was a question that came up in our group, and we got to it at the very end. So I thought it was a good one to throw out. It didn't completely address the questions, but Maria lives in a small rural area, and if they disaggregate data, that could cause harm to some specific children. And she was trying to think of how to address that without going too far into detail. Does anyone have any thoughts for Maria?
Let's turn it over to the group first, and then if not, we'll see if anybody from our team wants to address that. Anybody from the group have any ideas on how you might present information about identifying? How about from our team?
Hi, Maria. So the challenge with small sample sizes is that you can potentially identify a particular family or person when you're sharing data. And so this is one of those cases where we'll usually say it's probably not advisable to disaggregate data or to share data by group. And what we often, and I don't know what your sample size is, like, is it super small, like on your hand, like that many, or is it a little bit bigger?
We did the Healthy Kids Colorado survey, and our school population is probably a couple hundred. So it's not very big. And we were talking about like mental health and representing the different groups. And if we were to pull out like LGBTQ students or kids that were identifying as different than their like assigned sex, the population or the sample size would be so small that I could pick out which kid it was. And so, you know, what do? You want to address their need as best as you can. But if I go and pull out that data, then everybody will know exactly who it is. And so, you know, how do you go about addressing the needs and identifying your biggest areas of concern without like potentially outing somebody, really, because most of the time people don't tell other people, or they don't maybe know how to talk about it.
So usually what we'll do is talk about, I mean, and you're being really sensitive to this around thinking about how you report themes. And it may be that you don't report specific data for the LGBTQ community, but that you offer considerations. And it may be one of those situations where the data is used in a different way. So maybe it doesn't go into a particular, like a public report, but that feedback is provided in a more private way with people who can make decisions around programming or funding, but that it's not put out specifically into a report that goes to the whole community, but the data is still used. Sometimes we talk about like reports having multiple purposes. And so sometimes an evaluation will often just do like one final report, of the data. But I think there's a tendency now to think about multiple reports depending on who the audience is and what the findings are, so that they can be used in meaningful and ethical ways that don't necessarily out a particular community, but that that the data can still be used in a way that helps support the community. So that's one thought, and I'm curious to hear from others because we do have other participants here who are also from rural communities. So wondering if there are other strategies that you have also taken.
Maria, I was going to ask, like, are you looking at the data just for your school district? Because one thing you could do is report at the county level or even the region level. Our school district is also really small, so anything I report publicly, I've just reported out as Region 5 data.
Yeah, our county and our region are both data suppressed as well. We've brought this to CDPHE's attention, and they pretty much put it on us to fix it, which isn't really very fair because it's a 6-county region. So there's like 38 some odd school districts in the region. So, that's a lot of superintendents to deal with. But yeah, at this point, we're kind of discussing, if you went and did more of a listening group, what is the word? Like small group listening session to get feedback. Would it be beneficial, like if we pulled in adults to represent that group, maybe they would feel more comfortable talking about what it's like to be of a particular group. And that way we aren't so much in the ethical dilemma with children. But I don't know, it's kind of the same thing to me, is we have adults that don't want to tell people, or if they are, out in the community, that they just kind of want to live their life and not be harassed about, representing, being the only person or people that represent that group. So I can understand that and appreciate wanting privacy.
Maria, something I've done in the past is if I know there's a potential for that, I might reach out to some of the families in the area that I'm aware of who have queer identifying youth. And some of those families say yes, put it out there. Some of the families are not as sure. So that's one of the things that I try to do first, is if I know that's going to be one of the dynamics, maybe try to talk to somebody who could be have more perspective on what those families might, what the impact might be of that data collection.
And Marie, another thing, just to pull on what Ariel offered earlier, is still using the data, and so using or leveraging larger data sets. So whether it's regional, as you said, kind of the 36 districts, and or state level data that's available around this particular community, or even national, to indicate that, if you have a percentage that you can say, like, there's a particular percentage of young people or families who identify from the LGBTQ group. And based on this, we know from other data sets that these are issues that are common, or themes that have been shown, and do some of the in data analysis, sometimes we just call it triangulation, where you're just using multiple data sets to confirm an experience of a particular group, so that you can leverage whatever the action is that you think is important from those results. So that's just another strategy to consider too, so that you're not leaning on, a small group of people to be the voice for a community.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I would just say the same, just making sure you're aligning to what's the actionable, what's the action that you want to come from the data, and then like how would you use it, right? So Healthy Kids is pointing out those health factors and of youth. And so is it, you know, are we looking at making changes at the school level or getting more services, or is it an awareness campaign? And so that might help also direct what to do with the data, is keeping the end goal in mind with the change process. We have time maybe just for another comment or two if anybody else wants to share from your group. And thank you, Maria, for being like a little case study for us here. That's a huge problem. Autumn or Catherine, June, anybody else want to share from your groups?
I'm kind of in the same boat as Maria, as I'm actually just like straight south of her. However, I was in a group with Eric and Ariel, and it was nice to hear the different perspectives of our area as they have big tourism economy, and how out at our population, we are almost over surveyed, pretty much over data. Like there's actually, we're now at a problem where it's almost like a distrust with the data, and they're trying to figure out ways of how to get their different types of population, whether they be like seasonal or have been there for decades. So it was just interesting to kind of hear our different perspectives on data collection and where to hit those populations, and even how, like, coming up with creative ways.
Thank you. That's an interesting issue as well. All right, well, just to bring it a little bit together, and then I'll turn it back over to my colleagues. You know, we did talk about earlier about humanizing data as one approach. When you have a lot of data and combining it with stories of actual people or faces. And then the issue that Maria brought up is really big. So multiple ways that we can be really thoughtful about what are we going to do with this, and how do we ultimately help the people that are involved. That first slide that we shared around doing no harm to value added. So really spending some time in that space and carefully thinking through that value added piece. Okay, I'll turn it over to my colleagues. Thank you.
All right, so we're going to talk a little bit more about the planning process and what it actually looks like to get into the data sense making and interpretation. We won't spend too much time on particular methods necessarily, but more of those considerations around data sense making, recognizing that there are plenty of sources and resources out there that do provide a lot of those kind of more technical methodologies and how to go about doing that. So a lot of these things have kind of come up throughout today's session around who will be involved and how will you involve them in the process of data analysis, talking about, you know, are you collaborating with them truly, going back to that continuum of engaging folks, how much are you involving them, and in what ways, kind of to what Maria and Eric, you were both talking about, how will you be able to include those perspectives or those experiences while also trying not to breach privacy. So those are some things that are really important in talking about how you're going to do sense making and in which ways you can use the data that you have. It's really important too to revisit those questions that you were hoping to answer. We talked a lot about that last time and in the previous sessions around data collection. So is the data that you have able to answer those questions that you have and ultimately inform those actions that you want to take? It's also really important to not overburden folks, right, who you're collecting data from. We've talked about that before. So wanting to make sure that we're not using data or misusing data in order to answer kind of unrelated questions that we than what we have.
then the other thing is how you'll use the information. So that's something that we've talked about with the actions that folks are taking, right? So maybe it's that you can use the data that you have in more kind of closed circles in order to then inform action that is able to affect lots of people, right? So maybe pulling in on historical or more national studies about what it means to support our LGBTQ youth in schools, right? Because even if a school doesn't have a lot of identifying folks at the time, it's inevitable that it will happen. And so there's still opportunity without the kind of breach of privacy in order to take that information into action that you can use. So we'll go to the next and talk a little bit about what it means to have do some quantitative analysis of your data. Again, not going too specifically into methodologies or software programs or anything like that, but generally talking about what it means to do quantitative analysis and what it can really provide you with. So quantitative is really important to kind of establish the what and when for the story that you'll tell about the data that you have about your community or the community that you are working within. So some things that you can do with quantitative analysis is comparing a number to a benchmark or a goal that maybe you had set out before. Say you want, X number of students to be receiving school lunches. That they're eligible through SNAP, but they are not actually receiving those food items. That might be something that you'd be looking at in terms of who's actually accessing the services that should be available to them. You can also do some comparisons between two numbers. You can compare numbers across different groups. And then you can also put people into groups if possible. So we've talked about that a lot throughout this series and today as well, about what it means to group people together and what it means to keep them separate too. So there's a lot of considerations that you may want to take into account as you're doing data analysis, and be really intentional and careful with the groupings that you make too. I'll use an example of, say you are looking at students in the school system, as Rochelle was kind of talking about earlier, and kind of grouping the Black and brown and then the white students. Like, that is something to be very careful about. And it may not also always tell the whole story. That's often a story or a narrative that folks use within data analysis, but there could be other experiences that folks are having that you might not know if you only look across one, say, demographic kind of dimension. So you may also want to look at racial ethnic identity, but then also at gender or sexual orientation, and see, is it across the board folks from a particular community, all girls are experiencing this, all boys are experiencing this, or is it maybe Black and brown girls or Black girls who are experiencing this versus Black boys who might be experiencing something else? So it can be really important to look, even if it is just internal, if those findings don't end up going external, it's really important to interrogate the data and not just break it down in kind of a minority majority comparison, but really look into what are the true experiences that folks are having. And some quantitative analysis can be really helpful in kind of starting to get towards what's happening in a particular community or amongst particular people. So we'll go to the next one and talk a little bit more about qualitative analysis as well, and why to include that. As you know, with Colorado Equity Compass, we're all about combining kind of the harder numbers with the stories and the really illustrative pieces that bring those to life. So qualitative analysis can help with establishing kind of the why and how behind a lot of those numbers that we talked about previously, and create a more a stronger story, as Rochelle was mentioning, kind of that triangulation, right? You've got a lot of different sources to back up what you're saying, and to really build upon that narrative and bring in some heart into that as well. So a few things that you can do with qualitative analysis is you can identify similarities and differences in more depth, right? So you can understand a little bit more about why some of those differences might be showing up between different groups, or even what that experience has kind of looked like versus just, this is what's happening. You can talk about how that's showing up for each group. You can also explain the reasons for an outcome, the reasons that we might be seeing some of those differences in our numbers. And then we'll also look at, sorry. It also allows you to look at some unexpected results and causes. So maybe you found something in your quantitative analysis that you weren't expecting to see, and you might find more from the stories here around why that might be happening. And you might loop back to the quantitative analysis. So you don't necessarily have to do one after the other or start with one versus the other, but it's a really good practice to kind of go back and forth and see how are we channeling in on what's closer to kind of like the truth of what's happening in this community. We'll go to the next slide to talk more generally about some tips. I'll go through some quickly, but we've gone through a lot of these today as well, and throughout the sessions, wanting to make sure that we're making comparisons that are fair, appropriate, and as Rochelle kind of mentioned earlier, not blaming of individuals or groups, right? So it's not our students' faults that outcomes are looking different for them. It's oftentimes, more often than not, systems, racism that's at fault. And so wanting to make sure that that is the focus of our analysis, and not, especially as we're framing and we're reporting out on those things, that is not blaming of groups. We want to involve multiple people to look at the data and be really incorporated into the data process. As Scott had mentioned a lot earlier around the biases, right? We're all going to come in with our biases, and we're all going to come in with our different interpretations of data. But if we do it together, there's a higher likelihood that we're able to both continue to confront our own biases, but also be able to recognize and understand how others are coming in with theirs, and maybe also balancing out some of those things, or able to help you keep those in check as well. And then, as we talked about, don't force categories, don't force data into categories if they don't fit, or if it doesn't make sense for the analysis that you're looking at. And then as you go through the processes, particularly with qualitative analysis, finding quotes that will help you identify themes to tell the story is really helpful. It's often a really impactful part of our work, and something that we'll get into a lot during the next session around the stories. But as you go through the likely copious amounts of qualitative data that you have, it can be important to pull out quotes while you're going through that process, so that you can use it later and not have to go back through again and again to try and find quotes. So if something sticks out to you as you're looking through, or as your team is looking through data that you have, I would recommend to pull that out as you're going, rather than having to go back through everything again.
Yeah, thanks, Alina. So interpretation is one of those, I think, steps in an evaluation process that I think it's important to slow down. I think that sometimes we get some findings, and there's a tendency to just take those at face value. And this is where that engagement and empowering of community members is really important to help us understand what the meaning is behind some of those findings. And so there is just a good time as we've been talking about to share findings, but then use some guiding questions to help you think about what's the collective understanding now to help interpret what some of these findings might mean. So, you know, and just to kind of share what June was sharing earlier is like, there can be real generational differences in how we might interpret some findings. And that's really important to highlight. Or a community member might be able to say, well, you know, the reason why there's a difference or a difference between two particular groups is because there was this event that happened, you know, decades ago that still kind of impacts the way these two groups interact with each other. But so having that context is really important to help create meaning for the data. And so some of the questions you might be asking yourself are, you know, like, again, things we've talked about, who's represented, what does the data seem like it's accurate and credible? I've had data that I've gotten before and I've been like, this is really weird. It just it's not feeling right. And sometimes I've just had an error in my coding, right? Or there is an outlier that I need to go look at. And so kind of digging deeper into where there are some real differences or real unexpected findings is important. Sometimes, and Alina alluded to this, sometimes the quantitative data and the qualitative data don't match. And that's totally okay. That's information. And that's why we say it's important to collect multiple kinds of data, because I think we used the example one time at the beginning where a community that worked with the Colorado Equity Compass at the beginning of our initiative was saying that they're living in a food desert. But then what they found out when they did more deeper analysis was that they were actually living in more of a food swamp, where there were a lot of different kinds of foods that were available, but they were not healthy kinds. They were dollar stores or corner stores that didn't sell healthy food. And so kind of looking at multiple forms of data to help make sense of the story is important. And, you know, are there some questions maybe that you haven't been able to answer as you're analyzing the data? Sometimes it highlights that, oh, there's another question that we need to be asking ourselves or asking the community. So those are just a few things to consider in those community sessions to help make sense of the data. On the next slide, you'll see some methods for interpretation. And, you know, many of us on here are probably data geeks and we love data, but not everyone does. And so just encourage you to think creatively around what are some ways that you can make data analysis very accessible to the layperson, to somebody who's not used to analyzing data. And so we like doing things like having people put dots on different statements or dots on data to help identify where there might be some themes, or printing out the data even, and then having community members sort statements into things that sound the same or are super different. And so I think just creating hands-on experiences for community members can make it more meaningful for folks to dig in and to understand the data in beyond numbers. So these are just some strategies. We've also used sticky walls a lot when we go into community, which is essentially it's Jamboard is probably the modern version of a sticky wall, but we would like go in with a blue kind of fabric wall where you could stick different pieces of data onto it and move things around where you're seeing themes. So again, just kind of thinking about strategies that people might be used to and that they can use it and apply into a data analysis process. So we wanted to hear from you actually in our next Menti around what are some creative strategies you've used to help make sense of the data, especially in kind of a group setting. Are there other strategies that you've used that you've found successful that you'd like to share with others that are on the call today? So we'll run this Menti. I'll pop the link again into the chat. And maybe you can share thoughts and ideas, or if you want to unmute and share into the verbally, that would be welcome as well. I was working with one community that would have monthly data parties. And so, you know, whatever you can do to make it fun and offer food usually helps. We've done data gallery walks where if you have the resources to kind of print out large charts or findings of the data, people can write interpretations straight onto it on a sticky paper or sticky notes. So let me just share my screen and see if anyone has offered any ideas. June, did you want to offer something?
Well, I'm asking a question.
Sure.
Can you go to at least in your data gathering grouping, can you go to at least one meeting and give us an outline, excuse me, of from the time you started until the time you ended? Then we can talk about the interaction. Were people asking questions? Because let me precede it with this. We hold a resident meeting that invites everyone that lives in our neighborhood once a month, the fourth Wednesday of the month. And yes, we bring in people who are known around the community for them to speak to what they do. But I think that's going to wear thin pretty soon. And you don't want people to just come because there's something in the news that they're afraid of. And, you know, you want them to be interactive. I don't know if I'm explaining myself correctly, but you want them to be part of, not the menu on the table. You want them to be sitting at the table. All right. So any suggestions from one of those meetings you had?
So I always love sharing data back to people because I think it makes them feel like they're a part of the process, June.
Okay.
So it sounds like one of the things that you're looking at is like how engaged are people in community meetings and what thoughts and ideas are they sharing. And it might even be that you're having somebody track like how many times are people sharing a new idea or talking, or how many different people are talking and sharing ideas throughout a meeting. And like, you could even just share that back as a facilitated process, right? Like we heard from 9 out of 10 of you today with new ideas. And that's great. Let's keep that up. So I think there are different ways to think about how you can give live feedback to people right in the moment, and or think about over time, here's how it's looked at, you know, each monthly meeting over the course of a year. So anyway, I know that we're at time, so I'm gonna, but June, welcome you to come back so we can talk more at our next meeting too around what that could look like, or feel free to reach out to any one of us.
Well, I've been here for your meeting.
Yeah.
But just try to be quiet.
Thank you. I think so. We need to move on to the next. Sorry, I will just read off what somebody shared. When we have data come in, we have a dinner and talk through what the data is telling us and what the stories are behind the numbers. That's great. So just wanted to share this last slide here around how to stay in touch with us. If you have any suggestions for us about this session or interest for the next session, please feel free to pop those into the Menti. I've moved us on to the next slide. So if you have other ideas that you want us to consider, please do. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you all stay warm if it's snowing in your part of Colorado. Stay inside and stay safe. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.